Okay. Well,
Begin?
thank you again. Thank you again, Madam Chair. And thank you to all the witnesses. I've enjoyed hearing your perspectives on this bill. Ms. Fortier, I would like to get back to you, if I may. It seemed as though your previous thought was not completely fleshed out. And if you'd like to finish what you were saying in the next minute or so, I'd appreciate that.
I can't even remember what I was thinking. There's been so much that's been discussed through. I think I really do hear what Mr. Payette is expressing and saying. And I think even as we're talking, we need to be very careful that we are differentiating between new broadcasters and platforms. Netflix, Amazon, Apple, they're broadcasters. The difference is a gatekeeper that is actually blocking, you pitch, they green light, they move forward. And it's the broadcast system. It's just the current modern day players. Platforms are considerably different in that it is free. Basically, in most cases, if you take YouTube as an example, it's free platforms that content creators like us and other small companies are able to actually upload and self-distribute. It is absolutely a hustle to do that job. It's a tough go. It's 100% of the risk for 100% of the reward. But the sacrifice that you're making is for the opportunity to fully own your IP and be able to control that distribution. I know that it is not a perfect system. There's certainly issues across the board between legacy broadcasters, new broadcasters, and those platforms. But the algorithm manipulation is really something that we need to be incredibly careful of to determine that certain content is more valid than others, to give preference to one versus another. That's where the crux of 4.2 becomes so problematic.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you.
And thank you for your testimony. And Mr. Geist, you've written on Bill C-11, just as you did previously about Bill C-10. Can you articulate what you believe the government's objectives are and also how they should have drafted the bill to achieve those?
Sure, thanks for that question. So, listen, the government stated objectives, of course, have focused on the large streaming services. And I think we've heard a lot of talk about a lot of issues that frankly have very little to do with those large streaming services. So it's pretty clear that people look at this bill at a lot of different ways. Oftentimes, the bill has little to do with some of their core concerns. I think where the bill has, of course, got bogged down has been around user content. But I think there are some other issues even that have come up just now that I think are important to recognize. Mr. Biddle, for example, asked specifically or referenced the fact that Ian Scott said, well, we already have those powers now, and suggested somehow that was being ignored. I think it's important to recognize first that while arguably the CRTC has had those powers, I think first there's constitutional questions about it. Secondly, it does seem to me that if in fact they've already got all these powers, it begs the question, why do you need this legislation at all? It's a CRTC issue, not a legislative issue. I think we do need legislation because there is value in updating. But quite clearly, once you've got legislation that specifically identifies online undertakings, specifically identifies discoverability, it's a significant leap, and it does make a change in what that regulatory outlook will look like. I'd also quickly note, if I might, Mr. Champeau asked about the revenues being generated within the independent sector. And the reality is that in Quebec, from the BCTQ, 2.5 billion in direct spending in Quebec just last year in film and TV production, including productions from both Netflix and Amazon. That's record amounts. In Ontario, Ontario Creates reports it had its highest production levels to date ever, with nearly 3 billion in production spending. And so the notion that somehow there is a crisis in spending, I think, is undermined by what we've actually experienced to date. In fact, the CMPA itself tells us that the largest source of funding now for English language productions is foreign money. So money is coming in. There's a lot of spending. That doesn't mean that we can't continue to address some of these issues. But the reality is venturing into questions around user content, as this bill does, I think we've heard compelling evidence about why that's a problem. And I think we also need to recognize that the notion that somehow there's no contributions taking place and that we've got a film and TV production sector in crisis is undermined by the actual experience and data that we've seen to date.
Thank you very much. I think that time is now up, Mr. Falk.
Hey, thank you, Madam Chair.